Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everyone can hear me clearly, and I will do my best to not to talk fast, which I am prone to doing sometimes. My name is Carlton McClellan. I am a senior advisor for stakeholder engagement and partnership development to the International Labor Organization's Office of the United States, or ILO USA, as we'll probably refer to during most of this conversation. On behalf of the ILO and our hosts today, the World Affairs Councils of America, I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. And I just wanted to offer a few introductory remarks before we get going on today's discussion, which should be a very interesting and animated, we hope, conversation. Just to give you a sense of what my role here is today, again, is just to introduce this discussion, including its two discussants, and provide you with a little bit of background and context as to why we're even having this conversation. Many of you may know about the United Nations, but I don't know how many of you have actually heard of what we consider one of the UN's best kept secrets, the International Labor Organization, or ILO. You'll hear much more about the ILO during this discussion, but just briefly, the ILO is the UN's only tripartite agency as it brings together governments, employers, and workers. It brings these three entities together from its 187 member countries to set labor standards, develop policies, and devise programs that promote decent work for all women and men. But the ILO is not just a labor or work organization, it is a human rights and social justice organization. All of our, that's out there to look out for all of our fundamental rights to decent work. Topically, the ILO's work touches on everything from trade to supply chain management, to child labor, to forced labor and human trafficking, to crowd work in the gig economy, fair and equitable work, economic and social development, green jobs, and so much more. And in terms of its sectors, the ILO's work touches on every industry you can imagine, from agriculture to education to health to manufacturing and textiles to transportation and utilities. You name it, the ILO touches on it in some form or fashion. With such a diverse portfolio of work across so many sectors, the ILO's Office of the USA is very keen to reach out across the US and engage with the public across the US about the global work that the agency does, and really to just interact with Americans just to sort of share mutual interests. And it's for that reason that the ILO's Office of the United States has reached out to the World Affairs Councils of America with the hopes of engaging the office in Washington, D.C., and even more so the various members of the World Affairs Councils across the country. So that is part of the conversation we'll be having today, is really to introduce the ILO and its work, and to talk a bit about how it relates to your work across the United States, and to have just a conversation again titled A Human-Centered Approach to Building a Better Future of Work. That's the title of our discussion today. Excuse me. So getting into the discussion, who we have speaking with you today will be Liz Brailsford, who is the Chief Operating Officer at the World Affairs Council of America office in Washington, D.C. Liz will lead in a conversation where she will discuss various issues of the ILO with the ILO's Office of the United States Director, Kevin Cassidy. In addition to Kevin's title as Director of the Office of the ILO Office of the United States, he is also the ILO's U.S. representative to the Bretton Woods and Multilateral organizations. Kevin has a very long title. And I'll just give you a brief background about Kevin before I turn it over to Liz and we get the conversation going. Kevin Cassidy has over 30 years of international development experience, much of which has been within the United Nations system. Prior to his current appointment as Director of ILO USA, Kevin served as the Senior Communications and Economic and Social Affairs Officer for 11 years in the ILO Office of the United Nations in New York, with additional responsibilities for partnerships in North America. Kevin has also served in other UN offices, including the Department of Peacekeeping Operations on issues of landmines. He's worked in the Office of the Coordinator of Humanitarian Assistance and the Executive Office of Secretary Generals Boutros Ghali, as well as Ban Ki-moon, and some other United Nations offices. He's very well versed in multilateral agencies, not just the UN, but other multilateral agencies, and so he should, he'll be able to talk toward the role of such agencies broadly. Finally, Kevin holds a Master's of Economic and Political Development from Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. And Kevin is also a New Yorker, which we in the office try not to hold against him. But that being said, I'd like to just turn it over now to Liz Brailsford, Chief Operating Officer at WACA, the World Affairs Council of America in DC, who will lead the conversation with Kevin and help you learn a little bit more about the ILO and some of the great work it does. Liz, I turn it over to you.
All right. I think I'm on here. Thank you so much for teeing us up, Carlton, and welcome everyone. We're happy you're here. We're also happy to be joining forces with the International Labor Organization USA. We've recently partnered in what I hope to be a long, fruitful relationship for everyone. And as some of you may have seen last week when we released our 2020-2021 academic World Quest topics, ILO USA has signed on to be a sponsor. So we thank them heartily for that. We'll have a Q&A portion at the end of today's session. So if you have a question as we go along, please put it in the YouTube chat box. And so let's get right to it. Kevin, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to join us. We're grateful because this is an extremely fascinating, complex, and important topic. And not only does it affect so many of us, but it's deeply changing, radically changing, some may say. So there's a lot to consider and address and discuss. So just to set us up for our conversation, I know that ILO has had a very busy year. ILO takes a human-centered approach. It's not a labor union organization, but at its core, it's a social justice and human rights organization like Carlton mentioned. Yes. There have been many shifts in the year of 2020 due to COVID. So yes, a very busy year indeed. And I want to get to all of that, but I think first it'd be helpful to start a bit broader. So Kevin, if you can explain what is the International Labor Organization, an agency of the UN, I think that would benefit, we would all benefit from that explanation. And also, can you describe the structure of ILO headquarters, ILO USA, et cetera? Interestingly enough, there's no ILO Canada, but I understand that you have some responsibilities there as well. So can you say more about that also?
Great. Liz, thank you very much, and really a pleasure to be here today, and thank you to WACA to have invited us, and we are looking forward to our academic world quest with you. The quick answer obviously is that the ILO is a technical agency of the UN, and we break into sort of thirds. We're 1/3 lawyers, 1/3 economists, 1/3 development specialists, dealing with everything in the world of work. Maybe to roll back slightly is that the ILO is actually the first international organization of the modern multilateral system. The ILO was created at the devastation of World War II alongside the League of Nations in the Treaty of Versailles. And it was at a time of massive change. And we're at another inflection point here in the global affairs. Industrial revolution, economic transitions, the waning of mercantilism, the social unrest, revolutions taking part in Russia at that time, but also in Europe, returning veterans with no work. So the ILO is about social justice and decent work. So why is the ILO an important agency? So I'd give 4 characteristics to the ILO. So the ILO is tripartite. It's the only tripartite organization in the UN system. What does that mean? Tripartite refers to the interaction between governments, workers, and employers. And through dialogue, through negotiation, through compromise, the ILO develops international standards and norms. And that's the second characteristic. The ILO is a normative agency with a supervisory mechanism, the teeth of the ILO, which many other institutions in the UN don't have supervisory mechanisms, repositories only for international treaties. So the ILO's normative role, basically it's the constituents, the workers, the employers, and the governments sitting down at the table, negotiating on any issue. It could be on hours of work. I joke sometimes with students to say that our first convention is on hours of work, so we've brought you the weekend, so thank you very much. We've dealt with issues like maternity leave, violence and harassment, indigenous peoples, maritime standards. So the ILO is a very complex institution because work sits at this important nexus between the economic and the social. Everyone in our modern economic system has to work. So the ILO came into being to help set the rules of the road. There were no rules in the modern economic system because it was just competing models on many of the other models that were out there. So the ILO was at the birth of our modern capitalist system, and we are very much a part of that. So the ILO itself is a major international economic actor that advises governments and international organizations on economic and social issues. The third characteristic about the ILO is that we are the authoritative source of labor research and statistics. Nowhere in the world has a institution gathered this information, built capacity of the national statistical agencies, and helped these developing countries build these institutions and capacities themselves. The fourth characteristic of the ILO, which many other UN agencies do share, is the technical cooperation and advice role. The ILO not only advises governments on once they have ratified a convention, and with the ILO, there is no ascribing or acceding to you can only ratify or not. And when you ratify that convention, the ILO works with you through its lawyers and through our economists to help you develop policies on how to meet those provisions of the international standards themselves. So this technical cooperation and advice is hands-on, so working with governments or addressing issues in the field. For example, many people may have heard about the child labor problem in the cocoa growing industry and chocolate. The ILO is on the ground working with communities in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire to find opportunities for, say, the older siblings or the parents of these children, providing educational opportunities so children can be children, so that child labor does not go into those global supply chains. So the ILO has a very complex aspect to it. The ILO, as I think, Liz, you've just alluded to, is a human rights institution. The ILO's constitution has often been referred to, and also President Franklin Delano Roosevelt referred to the ILO constitution as the International Bill of Rights for the Common Man. It was also used as the primary document for the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by Eleanor Roosevelt. The ILO has also a very important role in today's modern economy when we talk about global supply chains or we talk about trade, and we can get into that. But maybe to address the two issues of the ILO USA, it's not like UNICEF USA where it's a non-governmental organization. We are a part of the ILO. I am just the office that is here in the United States. We have an office in New York, and for those who know, today was the start of the General Assembly's President's Week, and that's ILO New York. So it's just the name of where we are located, but I am an official of the international organization. And the office in Washington was one of the first offices created, because as you can imagine, at the end of World War I, you had an office in Paris, you had an office in Berlin, and you had an office in Washington. Those were our three first offices. Wow. So that's what we do there. I can talk a little bit more about what the ILO USA office does, but just to also cover with Canada, I am the representative to Canada. We used to have an office there. Unfortunately, as with most big organizations, the budgets are very tight. And we had to close that office just for economic reasons, but now we realize that that was a mistake. So I am also taking on that responsibility as well.
I don't know how you do it all. Your very long title says it all, but I'm not sure that everyone knows how far and how many tentacles there are of ILO and what a huge impact that you all have had throughout the decades. There are a lot of issues that you just mentioned a moment ago, and I want to get into those. I want to stay a little bit more broad for just the next couple of minutes, and then let's get more into the nitty-gritty. You mentioned how ILO USA is not an NGO, non-governmental organization, but it's actually a part of ILO. I think that's helpful for our audience to know. Can you describe a little bit more, how do ILO USA and ILO in headquarters in Geneva, I think it is, what's the relationship like? What's the independence like?
Right. So I report directly to the Director General of the ILO, Mr. Guy Ryder, who is our Director General. Obviously is the head of the International Labor Organization, along with the workers, employers, and governments, the 187 governments, workers, and their workers and employers in those countries. So we have a great deal of flexibility in terms of how we manifest the outreach. And so we don't undertake development projects in the United States. We do that in developing countries. So we may be working on, say, refugees who are fleeing Venezuela, and working with them in the local communities, as well as with local communities, to help them find jobs, to get work visas, to get settlement. And so so we work with the international community in that way. The ILO works in this tripartite manner around the world, so that I can take into account, for example, US concerns about international problems, and what are the concerns that we have, or that the US government, workers, and employers have about particular issues around the world, maybe occupational safety and health. And of course, COVID has really brought that to bear, and to reflect that in the deliberative bodies of the organization. So I do that through the government. So in Washington, I work with the Department of Labor, who has been a fantastic partner. And together we have worked on the issue of child labor. And over the last 18 years, we have seen child labor go down by 100 million. That wouldn't happen without having that support from the US government and a technical agency like the ILO. We also work with the State Department, Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, Population, Refugees and Migration, a number of other bureaus there as well. I also work, for example, with CBP, the Customs and Border Protection. And on that is about forced labor, human trafficking issues, child labor. If people are using, forced labor in their global supply chains, and we see instances of that around the world,
Right.
CBP wants to know, what does forced labor look like? How do we identify these issues? What does your research show us? And additionally, I go up to Capitol Hill and speak to representatives to share knowledge. So what the ILO is it is connecting and engaging with organizations and people to share our knowledge, our research statistics, and discuss how world of work can be improved, and what are the ideas and for policy that U.S. legislators might be able to utilize or to think about. Now, let me give you a couple of examples. Everyone has heard of Social Security, an important social safety net in the United States, although not as well funded as it should be. But Social Security is a whole cloth idea of the ILO. Francis Perkins, the labor secretary under FDR, came to our conference in 1934, loved the idea, brought it back, spoke to FDR about it, and it seemed to be a very good benefit alongside the public works program. So Social Security is what we think about in what we call social protection. And this is a lifelong or a life cycle approach, looking at from young people and having nutrition, access to pre-K education. It's looking at access to education for students. It's looking at transitions from school into work, active labor market policies, transitions from job to jobs, upskilling and reskilling as the world of work changes, and then also providing support for people in their old age. The ILO also works on child labor, forced labor, human trafficking issues. We have the largest program to eliminate forced labor in the world, and that is supported largely by the US government, but there are other governments like Germany and the Netherlands who also support the work we do. We work on trade issues, global supply chains. We are now working with the US government, the Canadian government, and the Mexican government on the USMCA or CUSMA or TMEC, whatever country you're from. But it's the trade agreement that we're looking at to ensure that there is no forced labor, no child labor, no discrimination in the workplace, plus also democratic institutions that will allow collective bargaining so that workers have a fair deal in their workplace. Global supply chains, occupational safety and health, migrant workers, the green economy, transitioning from a high carbon to low carbon economy, looking at jobs for peace and resilience. The ILO believes that having a decent job is the best way to find security and a way out of poverty. So work is absolutely essential to having a robust and resilient world around us. How are we operationalizing that beyond the governments, beyond the employers, beyond the workers? We are also reaching out and leveraging our global expertise to share with universities, not only with the students, but also the faculty. And for the students out there, we are also helping to encourage you to join the ILO or look at careers in the UN system, and that will be a part of our university partnerships. We work with researchers and think tanks and foundations. We work with businesses, issue-oriented groups, civil society, local legislators, media. So it's really important to have a very broad coalition of like-minded groups working together on creating a better future of work and realizing decent work for all women and men in the world today.
I love to hear how many points of the globe that you're touching and supporting. It's just great to hear that you're on our side and you're working for the labor force. You're supporting us and doing what you can to make it better. So thank you. That was a very comprehensive overview on what you all do. I think that segues us well into getting a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of these issues. And so you mentioned trade deals. There's a lot of trade deals going on. You mentioned the USMCA. That was ratified this year. It went into effect on July 1st. Canada being the last one to ratify it in March of this year, I believe. But UK and Japan just announced their bilateral trade agreement, and UK will obviously be doing a lot more negotiating in terms of Brexit with other countries. And the list goes on. So where does ILO come into play with trade, the trade implications, the labor implications of trade? What's your part in that?
Right. Basically, we are central to that discussion. And before getting to the current point, let me just wind the clock back slightly. Many of you out there today will know of the World Trade Organization. Back in 1998, one of the first ministerial meetings, which took place in Singapore, they had on the table the issue of looking at labor rights in trade. And the WTO said that, we are not set up to do that. We are just looking at the commerce. We are looking at the mechanics. It is for the ILO, which is the international organization dealing with all of the issues in the world of work, to address that. So the ILO was placed at the center by the international community for that. What you'll see today, and we'll look at, for example, the USMCA trade agreement, the labor chapter in that refers specifically to the International Labor Organization, and more specifically, the Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. Now, the Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work is a foundational document for the ILO. Every government that's a member of the ILO, by virtue of their membership in the institution, must respect no child labor, no forced labor, no discrimination in the workplace, and freedom of association, collective bargaining. Freedom of association is a very interesting issue, and freedom of association has underpinning that foundational rights. And many of you will understand, as I say this, where the other documents in the US context come from. Freedom of association is about freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, and freedom of assembly, right? So these are foundational rights in the US as much as they are for the international community as well. And it's not just for workers, but also for employers. Employers need institutions to work together. Our partner in the United States on the employer's side is the U.S. Council for International Business, and we work very closely with them. And they are approaching us about, for example, the issues on child labor, maybe in cotton growing, or looking at the issues of discriminatory attitudes, which may put them at a deficit. So international standards are not just about, imposing upon, governments or creating roadblocks for business, but also this creates the way in which the international economy operates. So very, very important. Now, the declaration was first mentioned, and of course this did not come to fruition, but in the development of the TPP for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that was when this idea about having labor rights was front and center. Our Director General is committed to helping achieve the realization of these rights under the labor chapter, because they specifically refer to the ILO. And it's very important that others understand that it is about protecting investments, not only just for individuals and trading their skills and time and energy for remuneration, but also for businesses that are investing in these countries. You know, Mexico is a big trading partner for many countries. So, and just to give you a sense of the scope and scale, because a lot of people question, well, multilateral organizations waste money. The amount of money that is being set aside to make sure that the trade agreement works is equivalent to less than 1 hour of trade between all three of those countries.
Wow.
So it is a very effective and very efficient way of dealing with that. Now, we will have a long road ahead, because it is about power dynamics and changing the structure of maybe the unions in particular countries, or about the behaviors of certain enterprises. And so, but in the end of the day, that this protects not only the workers, but the employers and the investment that countries are making to ensure that those global supply chains are free and fair. Because I think a lot of people, and many young people today, don't want to buy sweaters if they are using forced labor. They don't want to be, buying electronics if in fact other people have been subjugated to produce those. So I think there is a consciousness that's raising up, that people realize that not only makes a rights-based sense, but it also makes a business case as well too. So very, very important to look at that, and the ILO is front and center in those issues.
Speaking of scope and size, and you've touched on forced child labor a few times already, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. Children is an issue near and dear to many of our hearts, obviously, and we know that there's a lot of issues with that. I think down 100 million is a huge accomplishment, so I congratulate you on that. Obviously, that's been a huge improvement in recent years, but what initiatives or plans do you concretely have in place now to further improve the situation? There's always more work to be done.
Absolutely. It's, I mean, I shouldn't say unfortunate, but, these issues manifest themselves in different ways. So talking about, I'll give you an example for forced labor, is that our first convention, and again, conventions are recognizing what we want as a perfect world for ourselves. And conventions are a bit broad, so they're not too specific. They have to be adapted to the national consciousness and national legislation. So our first convention came out in 1930. Then we realized that the form of exploitation of the workers had changed from private actors to state actors. So then in 1957, we had another convention that came out to modify that. And then we now see the manifestation of things called human trafficking, which at the end, trafficking is about forced labor, debt bondage, commercial sexual exploitation, and we had to address that. So we came out with a new protocol. So these international standards are constantly updating and to take into account those issues. But at the heart of it is about the abuse and exploitation of people and monetizing their labor. So in terms of child labor, for example, we have recently been invited to speak on Capitol Hill about the Harkins-Engels Protocol. This was on chocolate, and Senator Harkin from Iowa was a champion of eliminating child labor, and certainly assisted the ILO in a lot of the work or the accomplishments that we've had. So now they're looking at what has been done in the chocolate growing industries, or the cocoa growing industries, and how do we further improve that. So we will be providing, new estimates on the child labor in those particular regions. We'll be looking at the what has worked, what hasn't worked. We always have to update our knowledge base on that. And then what were the successes in the after action review? How do we make this even more effective as well too? So we are constantly working on the ground and ensuring that there's no child labor. It could be in palm oil plantations, it could be in sugarcane, it could be in the production of textiles, it could be in a number of other areas. And you can't blame the children or their families for this, because it's largely driven by poverty. Now, we are sitting in one of the, the richest countries in the world. Sometimes it's very hard to realize that, if you don't have an opportunity for good education and you have 4 or 5 kids, that's your social safety net. The children will help you earn money, will put food on the table, will ensure that you don't, go into starvation and abject poverty. So people are just looking to survive. So how do we provide for them? So we are working alongside other institutions about providing education, because an illiterate, innumerate child will be an illiterate, innumerate adult. It will not be able to fully contribute to society. I don't want that for my child or my grandchildren. I'm sure that people here don't want that either. So how do we ensure that people actually move forward? So it's the economic and the social aspects of that. And those are mostly in what we call upstream. So if you're harvesting cotton, or you're getting the raw products, the commodities, which are then exported. But companies have to do better. They have to be sure. And I know it's difficult for most companies as well, because if you ask most business people, what is your 3rd tier supplier doing? Most people just don't know. And it's not because they don't want to know. Sometimes that may be the case, but I think largely it's because the 2nd tier or the 1st tier supplier doesn't want to give away trade secrets. They don't want to give away information that may put them out of business as well too. So so it really is all of our job to be very cognizant of the fact that we have to demand more from those who are generating jobs, which we absolutely need, and those who are on the ground, the trade unions themselves and the workers themselves are the best people to be able to see that, because they are right there. So we have to work together in this holistic manner.
It's so intricately connected and so incredibly complex. This is not a problem that is going to go away quickly. And for me, it's hard to imagine. Unfortunately, it's really hard to imagine a world without forced labor, forced child labor. So let me press you on that a little bit more. Can you get a bit more specific on concretely what has worked? What created that opportunity to decrease the number 100 million? What's specifically working to fix this?
Yeah, I mean, I can name a few. There are others out there who will probably know these issues even better than I. I think the first one is providing education for young people. I mean, in a lot of the countries that we're in developing countries, where the GDP is really next to nothing. I mean, people are living on the edge of starvation, on the edge of abject poverty themselves. Providing educational opportunities, quality educational opportunities for young people is certainly something that has worked quite well, because now you're investing in them for their future and the future of their community, their family, their community, and their country. The second thing that has worked as well too is finding opportunities for their older siblings and parents, because when parents have opportunity for work, they're not going to send their kids off to school because they want them to do better. My grandparents came from Ireland. My grandmothers on both sides were indentured servants coming to the United States, but they knew that they wanted a better life for themselves and for their children, more importantly for their children. And they have sacrificed for us. So parents are willing to sacrifice no matter what country you're in, but they have to have the opportunity to earn some living for themselves. Those are two aspects. The other one, of course, is awareness raising. Awareness raising for businesses to realize that using child labor is not a competitive advantage. It actually is against the human rights norms, but it also is increasingly against the laws in countries. Now, the Department of Labor has a mobile app, which is, I believe, called Sweat and Toil. They also have an annual report, which is, I think, has just recently come out. And you can see all of the different sectors where child labor can be used. It's absolutely fascinating reading, I mean, for people who are in development issues, for what has worked. So raising that awareness and putting them on notice that you cannot continue using that. And then, of course, it is legislation that prohibits that. I mentioned CBP before. There was, we'll go back in history, the Smoot-Hawley Act, which had a domestic consumptive demand exemption, which meant that if child labor was used in, harvesting coca seeds for the chocolate, as long as, if we didn't, in fact, have enough coca seeds here, that's okay, and we'll brush that aside. Now, that's been taken away. There is no consumptive demand exception. So now companies are being asked to prove that there is no child labor or forced labor in their global supply chains. And it cannot just be voluntary. I know that may diverge from some of the colleagues in the development sphere, but if it is voluntary, you get certain compliance, you get lots of kind of big events with celebrities and stars and people saying wonderful things. But I think we need to ensure that that there is something that can be done. That's specifically on the forced labor, but not on child labor at the moment. But so what else has worked with this is ensuring that you have coalitions of groups that get together. So industries get together and say, we are dedicated to not having child labor. And there are a lot of really good companies out there doing that. And I think that is, to their credit, is something that should be replicated elsewhere. So there are a number of things. Those are a few of them right now. I think in the future, we hope that we'll have more examples to share and to support.
Yeah, I think that international cooperation is so essential because it does touch so many pieces of the labor chain and the labor world. So that's great to hear. I'm going to shift gears a bit. We cannot have this conversation without COVID. I know we're all pandemic fatigued, but we can't have a discussion about labor without directly addressing the complications that we have due to COVID. So I'm sure we're going to be studying this for decades to come. There will be many books and white papers written about it. This time will be analyzed and it will be discussed and studied in classrooms around the world, I'm sure. Before the crisis, after the crisis, pre-COVID, post-COVID, the before times, the dark days, whatever you want to call it. I saw on the UN website in reading recently that it's business as unusual. I want to start with this. What's the climate been like at ILO USA during the months of the pandemic for all of us while we've been grounded, and collectively there was more time for reflection and pause? I imagine your environment was the exact opposite. So can you give us a feel for what it was like on the inside?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. And again, just to say that my heart goes out to those frontline essential workers who, while we are all looking after our health and staying at home and putting in place the social distancing, as well as minimizing our going outside and interacting in public, and so they were out there. They were the ones who were doing the work. And essential workers are not only the fire, police, healthcare workers, EMT. These are people such as restaurateurs. These are delivery workers. These are people who are driving buses and the trains. These are people who are fixing bicycles. So the list of essential workers is huge. And many of these people are the poorly paid workers as well, too. They are not earning their fair share.
No benefits. Sometimes.
No benefits, exactly. And many of them, and a lot in the healthcare, you'd be surprised to know, and those who are healthcare professionals won't be surprised, is that many of those workers actually don't have healthcare themselves. Their job may not provide that because they may be working for an agency that is it's a gig for them. So we can talk about that in the future of work context. And there is no voice for those workers. How do they negotiate better terms and conditions? They either work or they don't work, right? So we have to be careful. So the most important thing is to celebrate and to recognize that this has laid bare some of the major problems. The major problem of essential workers and underpaying. It is also laying bare about how we as a species are very social. Everything we do is social. I was talking to a friend of mine in New York City who was lamenting how people were moving out of the city left, right, and center because everything in Manhattan is social. It's the same thing in Washington, in big cities. You walk down the street, you see people, it's bars, it's restaurants, it's shops. So the economy has slowed to a grind, but for an important reason. Health is the most important aspect. If we are not healthy, we cannot provide for our families. If we are not healthy, we can't go to work. If we are not healthy, we are not productive at work. If we are not healthy, we may not be able to pay the bills because, again, there's been a changing nature of work where a lot of people are earning less and less, doing more and more work, having to get 3 or 4 gigs to string it together. So it has laid bare the lack of protections that people have. So at the ILO, we believe that work is essential, and with the essential and frontline workers being very important, but also we have to build back better. There's no safety nets. And this will bring me to one of the important recommendations and work that the ILO does. Some people have talked about, universal basic income as a way to kind of help people. And so, but, more importantly is having what we call these social protection floors. And Social Security is a part of that. And I alluded to that a bit earlier, and I'll explain that a bit more. The ILO, in its sort of normative role, has created a framework called Recommendation 202. And this recommendation talks about creating the sort of the basic social safety nets, what we call social security guarantees at national levels that everyone, every child, every resident in a country should have access to. What does that include? Access to essential health care. And this includes maternity care and other types of care for pre-existing conditions. The second element of that is a basic income security for children, providing them with access to nutrition, education, care, and other necessary goods and services. Now, we have that maybe through the SNAP program. It doesn't cover everyone because a lot of people see it as a cost. It's not a cost. It's an investment in the people that would become the talent pipeline for the companies in the future. The third element, or the third social guarantee on that, is the basic income security for persons in active age who are unable to earn a sufficient income. And this is for people who fall into sickness, no fault of their own. They become unemployed or redundant because maybe their skills are not matching the new job with the new technology that's coming out. Women who take maternity leave, who may not be invited back in or may not have their job held for them. I mean, again, totally against what we believe in the social justice of that. And also disability. So some people cannot earn a living for a variety of issues. And then the fourth element of what we call the social protection is about a basic income security for older people. Now, this is pensions. I joke half with the students now, but most students won't have pension schemes, not like we have experienced in our lifetime. So the whole nature of work is changing, and we have to create these automatic stabilizers, because if somebody falls into poverty, maybe through no fault of their own, the breadwinner in the family is sick, or maybe there was a difficulty that they were unable to overcome, a medical bill which wiped out all of their savings, people will have to move their homes. If you move your home or you leave your job, you leave your social network. When you leave and this is not Facebook, this is about how we as a society group in communities. And if you leave that community, your contacts with people and the ability to find opportunities for work become less and less. So it has a devastating impact. So this pandemic, and to people out there, don't think about post-COVID-19. There is never going to be a post-COVID-19. There will always be complex pathogens that are out there that we have to deal with. There was SARS, there was bird flu, there was Spanish flu. There are many different pathogens out there. And now, for example, with climate change and the warming of the planet, we see in places like in Siberia where the tundra is starting, the permafrost is starting to thaw, and it's creating massive problems because what was sequestered under the earth is now being emitted into the atmosphere. That could be carbon sequestration, or that could be other pathogens that existed years ago, decades ago, millennia ago, which are now being re-released into the atmosphere. So health is absolutely essential. And we have to, in the world of work, because the world of work is this really unique place between the economic and the social, where we deal with all of these problems. Sigmund Freud, and just in closing, used to say that work is the way in which people connect with reality. And I think that that's true. We are social beings, and work is a part of what defines us, what gives us our standing in society, but also something that not only provides us to put the basic needs on the table, but also a sense of self-worth.
I think it's really wonderful to hear your input on how this is not going away, and how there can be other things that are always going to come up, and things that are going to be defrosting from the permafrost. And so that's really good input. Also, I didn't mean not to mention all of the thousands and thousands of people who have died through this pandemic, and it is tragic. And I hope that we can do a better job of precluding that to the extent possible in the future. So I think what you mentioned through the health lens is at the crux of what we all need to consider and think about when the pandemic and staying at home and staying grounded seems to be an annoyance, right? Because the health piece is so incredibly important. So I think that's perfect for you to highlight. So I want to get into some questions, and I've got many more questions, and we've got some questions that are coming through to me through email and then also on Zoom. And so right before we do that, let me ask you one more question. We were already on pace to shift into more remote work because of the ease and access of technology. Does COVID just exponentially speed us up in that process? I mean, where is that going to lead us?
Yeah, I think it has. I think what's happened now is that we see that a lot of companies are investing in machines or automation because machines don't get sick. They do break down, but they don't have families. They don't take leave, and they don't demand more. Right. So companies are investing in machinery, which is displacing people. We've already seen that happening. And now when you have sort of businesses that need to have the workers or to keep on their production. And so investment in technology is even further displacing. We hope, and we can talk about this, I'm sure as questions we'll talk about the future of work, that we need to be investing in people and their capabilities. We need to be investing in the institutions of work, and we need to be investing in decent and sustainable work. So that's what constitutes the human-centered approach to this. But the mega driver of these complex pathogens is added to digital technology, climate change, globalization, migration. I mean, there are so many different issues that are changing the world, just like it did back in 1919 for the ILO during the end of World War II. End of World War I. So you had many of these same sort of inflection points that we saw back then that brought the ILO into being that we're now seeing here in this COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you. So I'm starting to get questions in, and one of the questions is, what are the biggest challenges you have seen while dealing with child labor countries with predominantly informal economies? Have those challenges been exacerbated due to the pandemic, or are those opportunities for change?
Great. I can answer them one by one, yes? Or do you want to, okay. So
you can mix and do how you want.
Yeah. Okay, so in terms of the biggest challenges, I think the problem generally, the informal economy, the informal economy, which impacts upon an even ever increasing percentage of the workforce in the world today. In some countries, it's as high as 82%. In the United States, I think it's probably a lot higher than official statistics because people are trying to string together different economic opportunities to create a livelihood. That used to be a definition of work in developing countries, but now it's becoming very, very much prevalent in developed countries like the US and in Western Europe. So informal economies, people are working in remote areas, in very, sort of technologically sort of absent areas. The digital technology is not penetrating to them. They're living on subsistence agriculture, and so COVID-19, if it's impacting upon them, it is impacting upon their health, not necessarily on the work. Is it creating more child labor? I think in some instances we do see that happening, but I think also the reality is that because of the lack of other work, there are older siblings and parents of children who would otherwise be in child work are accepting any job that they can. People really need to live. They need to put food on the table. The other challenges that we face is that sometimes there's a misuse of cultural custom. And this happens in many parts of the world where it is, it's good for the child to go out there and work, right? It's going to give them the sense of earning their own keep and all of that. But, let's not confuse child labor, which is the abuse of the child, and not allowing them to grow physically, emotionally, psychologically as they should from light work. I delivered flyers when I was a young kid growing up in Brooklyn, New York. I, did some work on my grandfather's farm in upstate New York. We all do this kind of work. That's light work. That's not child labor. Child labor is when it impacts upon the opportunity of the child to receive an education and be able to grow up as a child with others so that they can fully form and bring their skills and talents to bear on society around them.
Thank you. So have another question here. How does Qatar engage with countries when, as in the US, when political debates about minimum wage are intensifying?
Right. So we've recently had a webinar on Qatar. The ILO has an office there right now, and it came about because there was a concern in this group, which is focusing on mega sports. So Qatar won the bid for the World Cup. I believe it's supposed to be this year, 2020. I'm not sure if that's being pushed back at all. And there was a major influx of migrant workers coming into Qatar, and there was a concern that these workers, who were largely from Nepal or India and Pakistan, and also some African countries as well too, that they became the workforce for Qatar. There are 2.74 million people in Qatar. There are 2.4 million migrant workers. So it is an outsized migrant labor force working there on harsh conditions and poorly paid. What we have done in working with the government, working with the employers, working with our colleagues in the union the union organizations as well too, is be able to, and this has recently happened, is that the dismantling of the kafala system. Now, kafala system in the Middle East is about taking a job. You get hired by a middleman or a middle woman or a middle person, shall we say, non-gender specific language, in order to work in X country. And you would then leave your passport with them, and that you could not change those jobs. So right away, you became almost indentured to that job. And if you wanted to leave that job, you had to finish the contract, or you had to pay back the money that you had borrowed in order to get that job in the first place. So that system has been dismantled. It's the first time it's happened in the Arab states, what we call the MENA region. So in Qatar, they have gotten rid of the kafala system. And in addition to that, they have also instituted a non-discriminatory minimum wage. Now, that means that regardless of your national or origin or your ethnicity or your gender, that you should not be prejudiced in terms of your pay. So this impacts upon domestic workers, which is largely women, care workers in households, but also construction and other activities as well too. So this is now a game changer. And the reason that that's important is because a lot of migrant workers are remitting their funds back to their home country. And that creates economic growth in those countries as well too. So migrant workers are actually very important in the growth of countries. And again, if there are economic opportunities for people in their own country, and we've seen that, for example, in Mexico, where there's actually a reverse migration coming from the United States, so that people have been able to invest their money and buy businesses or to get to provide education for their children. So now that those economies are becoming more stable, the more opportunities for them, that migration slows down. So that's why I say a decent job is a very important part for resilience and stability in society. So in Qatar, we're moving in that direction. We're not out of the woods yet. There's a lot more to be done, but we had some very significant changes only because of this tripartite discussions. When the workers and employers and governments get together and negotiate this and be able to compromise, and that's the important thing. Today, compromise seems like a dirty word, but it is important for us to move forward in these international human rights spheres.
This is giving us such a good understanding. Thank you, Kevin. So reflecting upon the work of the UN in the past 75 years, what do you expect the future of the UN and affiliated organizations to look like? And what are some of the policy points that you're most concerned about?
So you're hitting to the heart of my work. When I grew up in my small town of New York City, always looking at the UN, I was enamored by that. I was a history buff. I loved languages. So I thought the UN was for me, and it still is. But the ILO is my home because the ILO is based on social justice and decent work. These are very important concepts to me personally. And I think us as a race, as a human race, is very important. The UN system itself was, it came after the ILO. The ILO just had its 100th anniversary. The UN is now is celebrating its 75th. And truth be told, I worked with Boutros Ghali during the 50th anniversary of the UN. The UN has been, I think, battered around for a while because there are so many different issues that the UN deals with. I mean, for those who work in this space, there are 34 agencies, funds, and programs that work on every single issue in the world. You have the 5 main organs of the UN system that are dealing with everything from peace and security, economic and social, and one that's trusteeship council is moving out when you had the formation of nation states. So the UN system has constantly been changing, constantly been growing to support this economic and social and political development around the world. We are hoping that through the work that we do in collaboration with our colleagues in the other UN agencies, that we'll be able to move people not just economically to a middle income, but also socially as well, providing protections for people. People need to have that protection because we are not, commodities. We don't get put into one machine at one end and then come out fully formed on the other. I mean, we are sentient beings. We have families. We have desires. We have to look at the individual and investing in the individual and investing in the real economy. So as this moves forward, things will change. So the UN will have to change as well. But the investments that are being made in the UN, quite honestly, are modest. During the 50th anniversary, we had a couple of different, sort of contextualizations or elevator pitches that, for example, the New York City Fire Department has a bigger budget than the UN. This does not take into account development cooperation work in the field, technical cooperation, or our peacekeeping operations, but the main work of the UN is equal to the Fire Department of New York City. Now, I have family that are firemen and firewomen in the fire department. It's not to slight them. It's just to say this is such a good bargain. It is such a good deal to have these institutions dealing with these issues day in and day out, and developing statistics, developing in knowledge bases on this. How do we more effectively, mobilize people's talents and skills and increase the pie? Not how we're going to split it up. So I think the UN will go through a bit of a difficult time, but multilateralism is even more important today than it ever has been before.
I want to finish with one last question. How are we making the workspace a safer space around the world for LGBTQ folks?
It's such an important issue. The ILO has always been based on a non-discriminatory approach to human rights, and that's not just about gender or sex or religion or political opinion, but it is about gender identity, sexual orientation as well. The ILO has had non-discrimination at the center of our constitution. We have a number of conventions that are on non-discrimination. And this is very, very important to the LGBTQIA community out there. We have recently also just passed a convention on violence and harassment at work. Work is how we interact with the world around us. And as people are in the workplace, and if they are being ostracized, if they're being mobbed, if they are being, persecuted in that or in their personal lives, I mean, you're obviously denying an individual the opportunity to make a living and to exchange their skills and talents for a proper remuneration. It's the same thing with women, right? I mean, 50% of our society for many, many decades, for centuries, have been denied to work, or jobs have been feminized, right? So we believe in equal pay for work of equal value. We believe in non-discrimination, and we believe that individuals who are in the workplace, if they have a certain gender identity that somebody else, or a sexual orientation that someone else doesn't like, they should not be persecuted for that. Now, that is absolutely essential, because this is about human rights. This is about nothing else except human rights. And that is the basis from which we start to build the world of work around us. So very important. So for the ILO, we are socially progressive in our thinking. We are a bit conservative as an institution, but I mean, sometimes you have to be, because these issues don't get solved immediately. As I mentioned to you with forced labor, we started in 1930, we changed it in 57, we updated it in 2010, I believe. So things constantly move forward, but absolutely people should be respected for who they are and what they provide, not the color of their hair or the person that they love.
I'm very happy to hear that. Thank you. Thank you. Well, Kevin, I don't know how you do it all. Well done. Well done. And thank you so much for joining us today. It was a true honor to have you.
Liz, thank you very much. And thanks to the unseen WACA people, Bill, and I believe Rachel, who is also helping out today. Thank you so much. And I look forward to meeting others and working with other World Affairs Councils across the United States.
And we would love to help facilitate that. So thank you. We invite all of our listeners to keep engaging in the conversation of the World Affairs Councils of America. Our next major event is next week. It is Conversations with the C-Suite. It will begin next Monday on September 28th and go until Friday, October 2nd. And you won't want to miss these important conversations with well-known CEOs like Bank of America, Volvo, Motion Picture Association, JP Morgan and Chase, about global recovery and change, and more sessions than that. You can register for it. It's free by going to the front page carousel of our website. You can also read about everything else we have going on and sign up for our newsletters as well at www.worldaffairscouncils.org. Otherwise, please support your local World Affairs Council. Kevin, thank you again. Thank you so much for the support and partnership of ILO USA. And thanks to our audience. I wish everyone a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you.